He thought he moved into a peaceful neighborhood to protect his son. Until the HOA police drew a gun on a 14-year-old black boy on his own driveway. But what they didn't know. His father is FBI. And this time, justice is personal. Stay till the end to witness how one man exposed a system built to silence families like his, and turned fear into federal justice. Marcus Reed had served his country in war zones, hostage crises, and undercover missions that tested every nerve in his body, but nothing prepared him for the quiet tension that came with moving into a suburban neighborhood lined with manicured lawns, white fences, and watchful eyes. After the death of his wife, he needed peace. More than that, his son, Jalen, needed a safe space to grow. A place where he could start fresh, away from the reminders of hospital beds and funeral silence. The gated community in Georgia seemed perfect on paper. Expensive, secure, family-friendly. But from the moment they pulled their moving truck into the driveway of their new home, Marcus noticed the shift in energy. The smiles of the neighbors were forced, too quick to fade. A man with a clipboard from the HOA appeared before the first box was unpacked, reminding Marcus of the neighborhood decorum guidelines and asking how long the moving truck would be on the street. It wasn't even 5 minutes. Marcus kept calm, gave a polite answer, and moved on. But he caught the way the man looked at Jalen, not with warmth, but with caution. Jalen was only 14, soft-spoken, kept to himself. He loved books, built robots with his own hands, and missed his mother more than he could say. He didn't deserve the kind of suspicion most people reserved for criminals. But in this neighborhood, being a tall black teenager in a hoodie was enough to raise eyebrows. Marcus tried not to overthink it. Maybe it was just the stress of moving, or maybe it was him projecting his own fears. He didn't want to taint his son's new beginning with old shadows. The first week went quietly enough. They set up the house, decorated Jalen's room with all his favorite posters, even planted a rose bush in the front yard in memory of Marcus's late wife. But the small things started adding up. One evening, a bright yellow HOA citation showed up in their mailbox, improper placement of garbage bins. Marcus had wheeled them out just after dinner. He checked the guidelines. The rule was 7 p.m. He had done it at 6:52. Another notice came the next day. Jalen's bike was parked outside the garage for too long. It had been there for an hour while Jalen worked on adjusting the brakes. A third came when they hosted Jalen's cousin for a sleepover. The guest had parked on the street instead of the driveway. The HOA didn't knock. They just mailed the citation and a fine. Still, Marcus didn't escalate it. He believed in structure, in order, in rules. That's what his job was all about. But he couldn't ignore the pattern. The neighbors' kids left scooters and bikes on sidewalks for days without consequence. Their trash bins were sometimes out all afternoon. No citations. No warnings. Only Marcus and Jalen seemed to be under a microscope. Then came the patrols. A white SUV marked HOA security began driving slowly past their home, twice a day at first, then 4 times, then parked across the street for nearly an hour on a Saturday afternoon while Jalen played basketball in the driveway. The man behind the wheel was always the same. Late 50s, buzz cut, sunglasses, a smug look like he was waiting for something to happen. His name tag read D. Simmons. He didn't wave. He didn't smile. Marcus knew how to read people. Simmons wasn't watching the neighborhood. He was watching them. And not in a professional way, in a predator's way. He began documenting everything. License plate. Time stamps. Videos. He even had a folder labeled HOA pattern behavior in his home office. But even then, Marcus hoped it wouldn't come to anything. Maybe it was just an old man on a power trip. Maybe the board had nothing to do with it. Maybe it would all blow over. Jalen, for his part, tried to ignore it. He never complained, never asked questions. But Marcus knew. He saw the way his son would look over his shoulder while walking the dog. How he started coming in early from basketball. How he stopped wearing his favorite red hoodie that the HOA had once described in a note as intimidating. Marcus sat with him one night, trying to explain things in a way a teenage boy could absorb without feeling crushed. He told him about being careful, about staying calm, about recording if anything ever happened. Jalen just nodded and said, "It's cool, Dad. I get it." But Marcus saw the fear behind his eyes. That quiet kind of fear that doesn't scream, it just hides. And that broke him more than anything. In public, Marcus was composed, always polite with the neighbors, never confrontational. But inside, he felt a growing storm. He had faced off with cartels, terrorists, armed fugitives. But the enemy now wasn't obvious. It wore polos, carried clipboards, and waved with one hand while dialing complaints with the other. And for the first time in his life, Marcus began to question whether even his badge could protect his son in a place where the rules weren't written. They were whispered behind fences, enforced by fear, and aimed at people who looked like him. He didn't know it yet, but everything was about to change. The second week in the neighborhood deepened the tension. On the surface, everything appeared orderly. Neighbors mowed their lawns on schedule, sprinklers ticked on at the same time each morning, and children rode their bikes in neatly spaced circles. But beneath that neatness was a quiet kind of pressure, a silent expectation that Marcus and Jalen conform in ways that were unspoken but deeply understood by everyone else. No one said it directly, but the message came in subtle forms: the stares that lasted too long, the overly formal greetings, the lack of any real warmth behind the pleasantries. One afternoon, Jalen tried to join a small group of neighborhood boys at the park near the clubhouse. They were tossing a football, laughing, eating snacks. He stood near them, polite and hopeful. But when he asked if he could join, the mood shifted. One of the boys mumbled something about it being just for members, even though everyone lived in the same neighborhood. Another boy whispered and glanced toward the clubhouse, and within minutes, the group scattered without explanation. Jalen returned home with his head down, the football he had brought still under his arm. He didn't say much, but Marcus saw him later tossing it alone in the backyard, pretending not to care. That same week, Marcus received another HOA notice, this time for unauthorized exterior modifications. It referred to a small, solar-powered security light he'd installed above the garage. A light no one had objected to until now. The same kind of light installed on at least 5 other homes on the street. When Marcus checked, none of those homes had received citations. He walked past them during his evening jog, counted the fixtures, documented everything. His was the only one flagged. Each day, the HOA security SUV circled a little more frequently. Simmons, the driver, sometimes slowed to a crawl when passing the house. Once, Jalen walked out with the trash and found the vehicle idling at the curb, engine humming, windows up, sunglasses behind the wheel tracking his every move. It made him hesitate. It made him question whether he was doing something wrong just by being visible. The neighborhood app, a private community forum, became another quiet battlefield. Marcus joined it reluctantly, hoping it might provide a sense of community or at least visibility. But it didn't take long for him to see posts that weren't overtly directed at him, but unmistakably about him. One post read, "Just a reminder that this is a peaceful community. Let's make sure all residents follow the decorum agreement, especially newer ones." Another post mentioned a recent uptick in loitering around property lines and encouraged neighbors to report suspicious behavior to HOA security without hesitation. When Marcus responded politely, asking for clarification on the decorum points, his comment was removed by moderators within hours. The loneliness of being watched but never welcomed began to wear on both father and son. Marcus was used to being an outsider in certain environments. But here, in what was supposed to be a sanctuary for his family, the weight of constant scrutiny felt heavier. It was the kind of pressure that didn't show up in reports or official complaints, but in how Jalen lingered at the door before going outside, or how Marcus kept one eye on the security feed while trying to enjoy dinner. At the next HOA meeting, Marcus attended in person. He sat near the back, listened quietly as board members discussed fence heights, paint colors, and clubhouse fees. When he asked about the specific reasoning for the citations issued to his home, the response was clipped. They cited community standards, precedent, and the need to maintain a harmonious aesthetic. When Marcus mentioned inconsistencies between his citations and the conditions of other homes on the street, the board chair redirected the conversation. "We'll review the issue and follow up," she said with a tight smile. But no follow-up came. One day, a package meant for Jalen was found opened on their porch. It was a new set of graphic novels he'd ordered. Nothing was taken, but the box was ripped at the seam. There was no security footage, no witnesses. Just damage. The implication was enough. Marcus didn't make a scene, didn't accuse anyone, but from that moment, he made sure every package was rerouted to his office downtown. The idea of safety had started to feel like a performance, something that only applied to those who looked like they belonged. Marcus kept his home pristine, his records clean, his behavior professional. Yet none of that protected him from the growing sense that he was being monitored, not by a system meant to keep him safe, but by one built to make sure people like him never got too comfortable. The true horror wasn't violence. It was control. The kind that crept in slowly, cloaked in policy, wrapped in civility, but always pressing down. Watching. Waiting. Hoping, maybe, for a slip-up that would justify the discomfort they already felt simply because he was there. It began as a quiet Saturday morning, the kind where everything in the neighborhood moved slowly, sprinklers ticking rhythmically, dogs being walked along neatly trimmed sidewalks, the hum of lawnmowers in the distance. Jalen had been up early, dressed in his usual hoodie and sweatpants, his earbuds in, leash in hand as he took their small golden retriever out for a walk. The sun was bright, the sky was clear, and nothing felt out of place, until it did. Within minutes of stepping onto the sidewalk in front of their own home, the HOA security vehicle rolled up from the far end of the street, tires creeping against the curb like it was stalking prey. Simmons was behind the wheel, just like always. His face unreadable, his presence heavy. He didn't wave. He didn't smile. He simply rolled down the window and started speaking to Jalen. The details were unclear, but the tone wasn't. It wasn't casual. It wasn't friendly. It was commanding, suspicious, confrontational. Jalen stood there, stunned, not understanding what he had done. The dog sat calmly beside him. They hadn't even left the sidewalk. But Simmons was accusing him of roaming without authorization, questioning why he was in the neighborhood, as if he didn't live there. As if he didn't belong. The badge on Simmons' chest was real enough to make it seem official, but the authority behind it was paper-thin. Still, the gun on his hip was very real. And in the next moment, Simmons placed his hand on it. The security vehicle door opened. Simmons stepped out. And that's when it happened. His hand moved to his holster, the snap undone, the barrel visible. It wasn't drawn yet, but the gesture was unmistakable. Jalen froze, eyes wide, body stiff. A 14-year-old boy holding a dog leash, suddenly treated like a threat. A neighbor across the street stood frozen, phone in hand. She had been walking her own dog when she saw the encounter begin. Something about the posture, the angle of Simmons' approach, made her hit record. She didn't say a word, didn't intervene. But her phone's lens was steady, capturing every second. Inside the house, Marcus noticed the HOA vehicle on the security camera feed. His instincts kicked in, not from paranoia, but from years of reading the tiniest shifts in behavior and posture. One glance at the screen, and he knew something was wrong. His son wasn't moving. Simmons had stepped too close. The dog's leash was taut, the animal still. It was enough. What followed happened fast. Marcus stepped outside, calm but focused, every movement deliberate. He approached, not yelling, not running, but projecting the kind of authority that couldn't be questioned. His voice was firm when he spoke. His badge came out first, followed by a demand for Simmons to step back. The moment Simmons saw the credentials, the Golden Eagle, the Department of Justice seal, his posture shifted. His hand froze mid-motion. The gun was never drawn fully, but the intent had been clear. Marcus stood between his son and the officer. The neighborhood was silent. Birds chirped in the trees. A sprinkler hissed. The moment had passed, but the damage had been done. Within minutes, blue lights flashed down the block. Local police arrived, responding not to Marcus, but to Simmons, who had radioed in a suspicious confrontation. Officers exited their vehicles, hands resting on weapons, ready for a standoff. But what they found was an FBI agent standing on his own property with his teenage son, a calm dog, and a furious neighbor holding a phone that had recorded the entire encounter. Still, the questioning began. Not with Simmons. With Marcus. What was he doing outside with a gun? Why was he threatening a neighborhood officer? Did he have authorization to intervene? Marcus handed over his credentials again, coolly, carefully. He explained everything, the pattern of harassment, the citations, the surveillance, and now, a man nearly pulling a gun on a child walking his dog on his own sidewalk. The officers didn't apologize. They didn't even ask Simmons to leave. They asked Marcus to de-escalate, to set a good example for his son. The neighbor with the video tried to interject, showing them the footage, but they waved her off, promising to review it later. The message was clear. Even with a badge, Marcus was still just another black man in their eyes, one who needed to be controlled, not protected. Jalen hadn't spoken a word since the incident. His hoodie was soaked at the collar from sweat. His hands trembled slightly as he held the dog's leash, refusing to let go even once they were back inside. He didn't cry. He didn't ask questions. He just sat down on the stairs and stared at the floor. Whatever innocence he had left, whatever small sense of safety remained, had been ripped away in a single, silent confrontation that could have gone tragically wrong. And Marcus, a man who had disarmed terrorists and walked into war zones, found himself shaken not by what had happened, but by how close it had come. Not in a foreign country. Not in a violent raid. But in the driveway of his own home. With his own son. On a peaceful Saturday morning. The fallout began slowly, almost deceptively subtle, as if the neighborhood was pretending nothing had happened. No public apologies from the HOA. No calls from board members. No explanation from Simmons. Instead, the silence grew deeper, more calculated, a silence used as a weapon, not a courtesy. The next morning, an official-looking envelope appeared in Marcus's mailbox. It wasn't from the police, nor from any court. It was from the HOA board, marked Violation Response, Escalated Incident. Inside was a formal letter accusing Marcus of creating an unsafe environment, causing disruption during a routine security patrol, and brandishing federal credentials in a threatening manner. The letter cited vague bylaws and referred to multiple complaints from unnamed residents. It concluded with a threat of fines, further HOA action, and potential escalation to legal counsel should he not comply with corrective behavior. Corrective behavior, the phrase echoed in Marcus's mind. It wasn't about safety, it was about submission. He understood the game now. It wasn't just about Jalen, or Simmons, or one afternoon gone wrong. It was about pushing them out. The citations, the surveillance, the intimidation, it was all orchestrated. A coordinated pressure campaign to make him feel outnumbered, unwelcome, and ultimately defeated. Marcus wasn't new to hostile tactics. He had dealt with warlords, gang leaders, and foreign agents who used fear and bureaucracy to control environments. But the cruelty of the HOA was its camouflage. It wore khakis and polos, it smiled at bake sales, it held holiday parades, all while using bylaws and concerned neighbor complaints as blunt instruments to isolate and remove whoever didn't fit their vision of community. And now, they were targeting a federal agent and his teenage son, using policy as their weapon of choice. Jalen, once curious and eager to explore the neighborhood, had retreated inward. He no longer walked the dog. He asked to be dropped off 2 blocks from the school bus so no one would see where he lived. He started sleeping with the lights on, asking if they could move again, somewhere no one knew them. Somewhere he wouldn't be seen as dangerous just for existing. Marcus tried to reassure him, but the truth was harder to contain. He had filed a formal complaint with the local police department, complete with the video evidence provided by the neighbor. But the response was slow, hesitant. The HOA claimed Simmons was acting within the boundaries of private neighborhood enforcement, and that no physical harm occurred. There would be an internal review, but no disciplinary action had been taken. Simmons was back in his SUV by the next afternoon, circling the neighborhood like a vulture, unbothered and emboldened. Marcus decided to take it higher. He contacted the FBI's Civil Rights Division, submitting a detailed report that included not only the confrontation but the broader pattern of racial harassment, selective enforcement, and targeted intimidation. He also began compiling statements from other residents of color, a small group, mostly quiet, but who admitted they too had experienced disproportionate scrutiny from HOA enforcement. Behind the scenes, Marcus's presence had started to rattle the board. Whispers floated around, some residents feared federal retaliation, others resented what they called overreaction. A few residents started keeping their distance altogether. The friendly waves disappeared. Children who once smiled at Jalen now crossed the street. The HOA may have wanted him quiet, but his insistence on standing up was becoming a threat to the fragile illusion of harmony they had built. The house, once a haven Marcus bought for healing, now felt like a bunker. He upgraded the security system, installed reinforced locks, and monitored the cameras religiously. Not because he feared crime, but because he feared retaliation. Passive-aggressive notes began appearing on the car windshield. The rose bush planted in memory of Marcus's wife was destroyed one morning, its roots ripped out and left in a pile near the trash bins. No witnesses. No suspects. Just another reminder. The final blow came when a motion was introduced by the HOA board to limit unauthorized law enforcement activity within the residential perimeter. It was a thinly veiled attempt to restrict Marcus from exercising his federal authority or even displaying his badge in the neighborhood. Though legally unenforceable, it was passed by a board vote and published in the monthly HOA bulletin as a proposed covenant update. That line was too far. Marcus realized then that this wasn't just personal harassment. It was a systemic problem. A neighborhood built on exclusion. An HOA that operated more like a paramilitary regime than a civic body. And a private security officer given more deference than a decorated federal agent. The question was no longer if Marcus would fight back, but how. The pressure campaign against Marcus took a darker, more invasive turn in the weeks that followed. It was no longer just passive-aggressive citations and subtle vandalism. The attacks began to creep into his professional and personal life, small incursions, strategically placed, designed to destabilize. His mail started arriving opened, sometimes missing documents. Packages delivered to the house were tampered with, resealed awkwardly, or simply disappeared. When he contacted the delivery company, they claimed everything had been marked as delivered without issue. A call to the HOA's Neighborhood Parcel Committee was met with feigned confusion and assurances that they would look into it. At the FBI field office, Marcus began receiving calls from internal affairs about anonymous complaints made against his conduct. Baseless accusations, alleging misuse of authority, unprofessional interactions with civilians, and conflicts of interest involving neighborhood disputes. Every complaint was unfounded, but each triggered official reviews and meetings. He recognized the pattern instantly. Someone was trying to build a file on him, even if it was hollow. Someone wanted to make enough noise to raise doubt. The HOA, or someone acting under its umbrella, was playing the long game, eroding his credibility one anonymous whisper at a time. Marcus wasn't the type to rattle easily, but the intrusion into his work signaled escalation. This wasn't just about pushing him out of the neighborhood, it was about dismantling him entirely. His FBI status had once been a shield, but now it was being used against him. The narrative was shifting. He was no longer a resident defending his family. He was being framed as a threat, unstable, aggressive, dangerous. They were trying to flip the script. One afternoon, Jalen came home from school noticeably shaken. A substitute teacher had pulled him aside after class, asking probing questions about his father. Whether he kept firearms at home. Whether he ever acted out when angry. Jalen, unsure of what to say, had tried to laugh it off. But the substitute wasn't laughing. He later learned the teacher had been planted, not an official employee of the district, but someone with links to the HOA's so-called Community Safety Committee. It wasn't just surveillance now. It was infiltration. Then came the HOA's emergency resolution, passed quietly during a closed session. It redefined home safety concerns to include any resident who invokes professional law enforcement authority in non-emergency situations without prior board clearance. While the language was vague, the intention was not. It was crafted to target Marcus. To silence him. To criminalize his presence under the guise of order. They wanted him gone, not just out of the HOA's jurisdiction, but out of the community entirely. The situation drew the attention of several advocacy groups who had been tracking similar cases around the country, particularly involving private security forces acting as quasi-police under the protection of HOAs. Stories of harassment, intimidation, and wrongful evictions had surfaced before, but few involved someone with Marcus's background. The local chapter of the ACLU quietly reached out, requesting information. They asked for documents, video footage, written citations. Marcus provided everything. Not because he wanted to escalate, but because silence had already proved dangerous. Still, the neighborhood itself remained quiet. Complicit. Those who had once smiled now looked away. A few offered soft words in private, but none stood publicly with Marcus. The board, protected by legal insulation and neighborly apathy, maintained its position. Simmons continued his patrols, his SUV a rolling monument to the HOA's authority. Rumors circulated that Marcus was planning to sue, or that he had lost control of his temper. The neighborhood app was buzzing with speculation. None of it accurate, but none of it challenged. At night, the streetlights outside Marcus's house flickered unpredictably. Sometimes they were off entirely. The corner lot near his mailbox, once trimmed and lit, was suddenly left in disrepair. Trash began to accumulate near his property line, debris, bottles, wrappers. When he cleared it, it returned the next day. Jalen, once vibrant and outgoing, rarely left his room. He avoided the front windows. He asked Marcus if they could just leave, even if it meant starting over. Marcus understood the appeal of walking away. But he also understood what that would mean. It would mean conceding to a system designed to erase him. To rewrite him. To make his presence, and his resistance, disappear quietly. He couldn't do that. Not as a father. Not as an agent. Not as a black man who knew what it meant when institutions flexed their power under the mask of protocol and civility. He began working on a formal federal complaint, not just against the HOA but against the misuse of private security as unregulated law enforcement. His case would be the foundation for something broader, a pattern of systemic abuse hiding behind HOA charters and community standards. Every citation, every video, every anonymous complaint would become part of the record. The neighborhood might have closed its doors, but Marcus was opening another one that led beyond their gates, into a fight that no amount of silence could smother. The legal storm began to gather force the moment Marcus submitted his complaint to the U.S. Department of Justice. He wasn't filing as a frustrated homeowner or a wronged neighbor, he was filing as a federal agent under oath, with documentation, timelines, corroborating witnesses, and undeniable video evidence. His report wasn't emotional, it was forensic. It outlined a chilling pattern: targeted enforcement, racially biased policy application, HOA-authorized paramilitary behavior, and clear retaliation against a federal officer engaging in lawful intervention to protect a minor. His son. The DOJ's Civil Rights Division assigned the matter to a special litigation section attorney within 2 weeks. That alone signaled something rare: the case wasn't being dismissed or shuffled into obscurity. It was being taken seriously. Investigators contacted Marcus, then began contacting others: the neighbor who filmed the confrontation, former residents of color who had quietly left the community, even a Latino family that had once complained about Simmons following their children home from the park. Their voices, once isolated, now echoed with collective weight. Word got out that federal investigators were poking around the HOA. The tone in the community changed quickly, not toward accountability, but defensiveness. The HOA board retained a legal firm known for fighting off discrimination claims. They began circulating official statements to residents, calling the allegations baseless, accusing Marcus of misrepresenting events for personal gain, and warning that unauthorized engagement with federal investigators could violate community privacy covenants. Their message was clear: close ranks. Instead of backing down, Marcus turned more strategic. He filed a public records request for every written citation the HOA issued in the past 5 years, filtered by race and household demographics. The results were devastating. Black residents, just 4% of the community, had received nearly 38% of all citations, most of them for vague infractions like loitering near the common sidewalk or unauthorized garage usage. The numbers spoke for themselves. He passed them to his DOJ contact, who added them to the active case file. Then came the media. A civil liberties journalist caught wind of the story and ran a feature. FBI agent accuses HOA of racial targeting after security officer nearly draws gun on teen son. It included body cam excerpts from Marcus's home security system, the neighbor's phone footage, and a portion of the HOA bulletin that described his badge display as aggressive posturing. Within hours, the article trended. Cable news segments followed. Marcus declined interviews, but the narrative took on a life of its own, not sensationalized, but sobering. The spotlight unsettled the board. Simmons was quietly placed on administrative leave, his patrols suddenly halted without explanation. The HOA tried to downplay the decision, but internal emails leaked. In them, board members expressed concern about liability optics, overexposure, and whether Simmons had put them in legal jeopardy. None of the emails mentioned Jalen by name. None expressed concern for the child at the center of the trauma. Their fear wasn't about harm, it was about consequences. Public pressure mounted. Advocacy groups staged a peaceful demonstration outside the HOA office. Former residents shared testimonials on social media under hashtags like #HOA and #JusticeForJalen. Marcus remained quiet through it all, focused on the larger goal, not revenge, but reform. He didn't want an apology. He wanted a reckoning. Then the state attorney general's office opened its own inquiry, citing possible civil rights violations by a quasi-governing residential body exercising unchecked enforcement. That inquiry brought subpoenas. HOA records were seized. Board meeting minutes were reviewed. Simmons' employment history was examined, including a previously undisclosed incident involving use of excessive force during his time as a deputy sheriff, which had never been disclosed to the community. The tide turned quickly. HOA leadership began to fracture. One board member resigned, citing moral conflict. Another leaked internal policies showing that the board had, in fact, altered enforcement guidelines to allow Simmons greater latitude after Marcus moved in. Flexible response protocols, they called it. Essentially, a green light for profiling. Despite the growing public outcry, there were still holdouts in the neighborhood, residents who refused to believe anything was wrong, who painted Marcus as a troublemaker, a man exploiting his badge for personal battles. They formed a countergroup online, claiming the DOJ was weaponizing race and calling Marcus's supporters anti-community agitators. But their influence began to wane as more evidence surfaced. Marcus knew the outcome would take time. Civil cases don't move fast, and community reform moves even slower. But the narrative had changed. Jalen was no longer invisible. The harassment was no longer deniable. The HOA was no longer protected by silence. And now, the system that once tried to force Marcus out had triggered its own collapse, brick by brick, policy by policy, lie by lie. The final unraveling of the HOA's control didn't happen in a dramatic courtroom showdown or a single sweeping indictment. It came through relentless exposure, undeniable documentation, and the slow erosion of public trust. The DOJ's investigation culminated in a formal report that outlined the HOA's repeated use of discriminatory enforcement practices, unlawful surveillance, and enabling of unlicensed security personnel to exert police-like authority. The language was precise but damning. The board had not only tolerated misconduct, it had encouraged it through structural policy manipulation and willful ignorance. The federal findings triggered a cascade of consequences. A civil lawsuit was filed jointly by the DOJ and the State Attorney General's office, alleging civil rights violations under the Fair Housing Act and color of law statutes. Alongside it came injunctions. The HOA was barred from issuing citations or conducting private patrols until the court proceedings concluded. Simmons, now under investigation for impersonating a law enforcement officer, had his private security license revoked. Additional charges loomed based on his prior concealed record. The fallout split the neighborhood in two. Some residents turned defensive, blaming Marcus for ruining the community and accusing him of bringing federal eyes into local matters. But a growing number expressed relief, even gratitude. Quiet conversations turned into statements. One elderly black couple admitted they'd received noise complaints every time their grandchildren visited. A Filipino nurse recalled being cited for drying laundry outdoors, something no white neighbor had ever been fined for. What had once been whispered in fear was now shared openly, validated by data and law. Under pressure, the HOA board resigned en masse. A court-appointed receiver was brought in to oversee the community's operations during the legal proceedings. New interim elections were scheduled, this time under strict oversight from the state's Housing and Civil Governance Division. Transparency reforms were ordered, board meetings would be recorded, votes documented, financial reports publicly posted, and all enforcement actions required to be reviewed by a third-party legal consultant before implementation. Marcus never attended any of the town hall meetings. He wasn't interested in symbolic apologies or performative change. His focus remained on ensuring the reforms had teeth. He collaborated with civil rights lawyers to draft a proposed set of legislation targeting abuse by HOAs across the country, including restrictions on hiring private security, clear limits on HOA authority, mandatory training on racial bias, and avenues for federal oversight in closed residential communities. The proposal gained bipartisan support and began moving slowly through the legislative process. For Jalen, the change was more personal. His school district assigned him a mentor, and therapy sessions were arranged to help him process the trauma of the confrontation and the months of harassment that followed. He began to regain his confidence, not overnight, but steadily. He no longer asked to be dropped off blocks away from home. He walked the dog again. He applied for a youth leadership program centered on civic justice. In his application essay, he wrote about fear, but more importantly, he wrote about courage, and watching someone stand up when every voice told them to stay quiet. The neighborhood, once obsessed with conformity and silence, began to look different. Lawns still sparkled and mailboxes still gleamed, but the facade had cracked. No longer was everything hidden behind trimmed hedges and HOA newsletters. New residents arrived, drawn by lower property values and promises of reform. They asked questions. They attended meetings. They voted. Some long-standing residents moved out, preferring to find places where their version of order wouldn't be questioned. The media attention faded, but the legal proceedings continued. The HOA faced multiple class action lawsuits from former residents. Settlements were discussed behind closed doors. The insurance company that once protected the board from liability began refusing to cover misconduct-related claims. Financial pressure mounted. At one point, the community faced the possibility of bankruptcy, not from external forces, but from its own decisions finally catching up. Marcus kept working, though his case became a quiet reference point across federal law enforcement circles. He was seen as the agent who took on a private governing body and won, not with bullets or threats, but with evidence and principle. Younger agents began reaching out to him for advice. He didn't seek attention, but he understood the importance of setting a precedent. What happened in his neighborhood could happen in others. If it could be challenged once, it could be challenged again. The house he once considered selling became his symbol of resolve. He made no renovations, no landscaping upgrades. It stood exactly as it had, a quiet reminder that justice didn't always come swiftly, but it could come, if someone was willing to hold the line. What started as an ordinary suburban standoff between a father and a private security guard became a national conversation about race, authority, and the unchecked power of privatized governance. And in that conversation, Marcus's name stood not just as a headline, but as a warning, and a promise. And that's the story of how one man, armed with nothing more than truth, integrity, and the badge he refused to abuse, stood up against a system built to silence him. Marcus didn't just protect his son, he exposed a dark undercurrent hiding behind gated fences and manicured lawns, a warning about unchecked power and quiet discrimination. If this story moved you, share it. Let others see what happens when justice doesn't wear a uniform, but walks through the front door of a neighborhood that thought it could rewrite the rules. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more powerful true stories. And remember, silence protects the oppressor, but action creates change. Stay aware. Stay brave. And stay human. We'll see you in the next story.